Today, I'm filming a video that I've wanted to make for a really long time. For context, Columbia has a core curriculum. So one of these classes is called Literature Humanities, or Masterpieces of Western Literature. It's a freshman core class that lasts for the whole year, and basically in the curriculum, we read a lot of different masterpieces of Western literature. So I thought it would be fun to do it with the books that I had to read for this class. The first thing that I want to do before we get started is introduce the categories that I've created. The first one that I wrote was Currently Kissing the Earth. That's the vest here. So that's a reference to Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, and it's basically just my favorite books. Books that I would probably read again, books that I had a great time reading, probably books that I annotated too. A fun fact about me is I personally really hate annotating books, so even though our teacher was really into annotation, I often just did not do that unless a book actually moved me to doing it. The second category is Holding a Symposium for. Also a book that I enjoyed, maybe not as much, but it is a book that I like talking about. The third category is Indifferent, but in a good way. So these are basically the more meh books that I like them, I wouldn't reread them, and I didn't have a lot to say about them, but they were all right. The next category is kind of worse. It's called Why Did I Pay Tuition for This? So there were definitely some books that I read throughout the year where I stopped and thought, I do not need to be taking a class for this book. So I wanted to create a category dedicated to those books that I just did not think fit in the curriculum, and I did not understand why I was having to pay to read them. And then the last category is called Throw into the Pits of Dante's Hell. And these are just the books that I hated, I detested, I would have thrown them out of the curriculum, I would never make anyone read them. So the very first book that we have to read is the Iliad. I actually ended up enjoying this more than I thought I would. I was really afraid of this book actually, and I didn't have a lot of exposure to classics, so I thought it would be very hard for me to understand it. I was worried about the translation. I got really into all of the background of all the characters. I really liked the way it was written, the use of metaphors and similes and things like that. It was really interesting to get to know the writing style of Homer. The worst part about this book is honestly probably just the time constraint that Columbia put on us to finish the book, because when I was reading it over the summer and just taking my time with it, it was going pretty well and I enjoyed it. But you definitely don't want to have to read 6 books within one day for class. Now that I'm thinking about it, I think I might actually go ahead and put it into Holding a Symposium for, which is kind of a surprising move, I think. By the way, I'm also going in the exact order of the books we read. Okay, the next book that I have up here is the Odyssey. Just like the Iliad, I went into reading this book with a lot of fear. I've actually read the Odyssey before, probably when I was about 12, and I did not get it because I was 12. So that was basically all of my exposure to the Odyssey, basically just the memories that I did not understand it, did not enjoy it, did not get any of it. But I actually really enjoyed reading this. Also, this is probably the best translation that exists right now. It's by Emily Wilson. It makes everything so clear, straightforward, to the point. So if you're interested in reading this, would 100% recommend Emily Wilson's version. So this book is actually a gift from the class of 2026 Columbia College Alumni Association, which I think is pretty cool. This is not relevant to the ranking, or it shouldn't be relevant, but I really love the cover of this book and the way that the pages are sort of distressed looking. And as I'm going through this book, I actually see that I did leave annotations. So as I was saying, I'm not a big annotation person, but I was annotating this book, which I feel like is a good sign. I personally am not a huge fan of the characters in this book or the exact plot. I don't think any of them are particularly good people, but I think there is something to be said about this way the story is told. Once again, I think the one thing I really didn't like was the time constraint for reading it. But other than that, I thought it was pretty good. So I think I'm gonna also put it in Holding a Symposium for. I know I said that I was going to go in order of the books we read, but this one is a little bit different. This is the New Oxford Annotated Bible. We read different sections of this book over the year. So during the first semester, we read Genesis and then Song of Songs, and then we read Job, and then we ended by reading the Gospels. I am just going to rank all of the readings as one. I personally don't enjoy reading anything in the Bible. It's hard for me to read it even as a literary text sometimes, so I do have some bias in that. But looking at it from a literature perspective, I did just find it pretty boring, except Song of Songs. Song of Songs was the only one I found interesting. Everything else was kind of like raking my nails against a chalkboard. And I'm saying this from a literary standpoint, so nobody come for me. I just did not enjoy it. I felt like there was really nothing to analyze or nothing more to analyze other than what people have already said about it over the past hundreds and hundreds of years. And had I wanted to read the Bible in any capacity, I could have found another way to do that. So for that reason, I am actually gonna go ahead and put this in why did I pay tuition for this. Moving on to the Oresteia. The Oresteia is basically a trilogy of Greek tragedies, and it follows the initial murder of Agamemnon by his wife Clytemnestra. So there are a lot of connections from the Iliad and the Odyssey. I thought this reading was kind of cool. I like the introduction of the Furies and of the court system into what we were reading. My favorite play was definitely Agamemnon because it's just really cool the way everything is written with Clytemnestra. So I thought that was actually fun to read, and I remember a lot of people in our class really liked that. I honestly wasn't a huge fan of the other two plays though. I thought they were kind of boring. So I think I'm gonna put the Oresteia in indifferent, but in a good way. I didn't mind reading it. I probably will never crack this open again though, but it had a strong start. The next text we covered was If Not Winter by Sappho. This is actually a collection of her poetry, but a lot of Sappho's poetry was lost and only recovered as fragments. If Not Winter is a translation of the remaining poetry by Anne Carson. I think that her translation does a really great job of expressing all of the ideas in Sappho while still keeping the beauty of the fragmentation. I absolutely loved these poems. This was also a really quick read, which was super refreshing after reading books like this and then the Bible. Having something that it was just really quick and fast to go through was great. This is definitely something I would reread. This is something I would recommend to other people to read. I couldn't shut up about this actually the first time I read it. I am going to put If Not Winter in Currently Kissing the Earth. The next book is the Aeneid by Virgil. I detested this book. I thought it was the most boring thing I'd ever read. I had to claw my way through to finish this freaking book. It was honestly just so boring. I went into this book slightly excited because I'd heard of Dido and Aeneas, but only from the opera by Henry Purcell, Dido and Aeneas. So that was all the context I had going into this, and it was very disappointing to find out that with the length of this book, it is just so boring. Nothing interesting happens despite how much Virgil apparently had to say about it. This was just 100 times more interesting than Virgil, and the class sessions on this guy were so boring, it made me want to cry. There was nothing to talk about. There were no thoughts going through Virgil's head apparently. There was nothing to really analyze. It was so painfully boring to read. All of the battles, terribly boring. The bad guy, boring. The ending was slightly cool, still boring. And it wasn't even a question of why was I reading this for class. I understood what the point of it was. It's Virgil, but it's just such a terrible book. So for that reason, I'm gonna have to throw it into the pits of Dante's hell. The next text we read was the Enuma Eliš, which is a Babylonian creation myth. So Enuma Eliš was similar to Genesis in the sense of having this creation story, except I would say it was more focused on the gods and goddesses rather than humans themselves. I liked reading it, but we read it so quickly in class that, to be honest, I don't have a great memory of how I felt about it. So I think for that reason, I'm actually gonna put it in indifferent, but in a good way. We followed up Enuma Eliš with the Exaltation of Inanna. So in the Exaltation of Inanna, we're focusing on Inanna, who was a Sumerian queen of heaven and the goddess of love, and the relationship that she has with the author Enheduanna. I thought this text was extremely beautiful. There are some really poignant moments of writing and a lot of specific metaphors used that reminded me of Sappho, and also a lot of modern poetry that we see. And once again, I just got excited anytime we read something that was related to women. I'm going to put it in holding a symposium for, just because it was really beautiful. All right, the next text we're looking at is Symposium by Plato. I thought that this was kind of a funny text, but something I also really enjoyed reading. I've read Plato a couple times before in philosophy classes, but Symposium was more focused on the idea of love and thinking about how different people and philosophers perceive it. There's also a lot of really interesting ideas about the origins of love. So just like its namesake, I think I'm gonna go ahead and put it in holding a symposium for. You know what? Actually, now that I'm looking at it, I might want to go ahead and put it in currently kissing the earth, because I think this is a text I would definitely like to read again and just something that I really enjoy discussing in class. All right, the next text is The Golden Ass by Apuleius. I had no idea what was going on and who in Columbia's core curriculum decided that we should read this. This was just an altogether super bizarre book. I am grateful for the translation we read though, because it made it actually sound like modern English, and so it was easy to get through. But this was such a weird book. So Apuleius was known as kind of the father of comedy, or where comical writing comes from. And a lot of people have revered this guy as just like being a great inspiration for writing. Personally, I don't know if I felt the same way. I did think that the book was interesting to some extent, but a little bit too weird in my personal opinion. So the book focuses on this guy whose name I cannot remember. From one circumstance to another, he ends up becoming a donkey, and he spends the rest of the book in his donkey form trying to figure out what's going on, how to change himself back. Overall, I didn't really mind reading this book, but it was super weird. There is a whole scene where the man, once turned into a donkey, is basically getting pimped out to women and having sex with them as a donkey, which is a sentence I never thought I would have to say. So this definitely made me feel uncomfortable and had me leaving class a couple times just thinking what the hell I was doing with my life. In general, we focused way too much on all of the weird sexual stuff with this donkey in class, and that was just personally not my jam. For that reason, I'm gonna go ahead and put The Golden Ass in why did I pay tuition for this. We are on the last text of the first semester. So this is Father Comes Home from the War by Susan Laurie Parks, basically a retelling of the Odyssey. I was excited to read this play because I'd heard so much about Parks, and also just because it was a much shorter text than some of the other books we've been reading. But to be honest, I don't really have an opinion as to whether or not I enjoyed it. I don't think I really fully understood the text. I didn't dislike the play, but it's also not something I would plan on rereading again. There were also some bizarre elements that I didn't fully understand because I was reading the text, and I think it would have been better if I'd had the opportunity to watch a recording or go see the show live to see what exactly the staging was supposed to look like and how the characters were supposed to interact with each other. And it's hard to get the full understanding of a play if you're just reading the stage directions and things like that. However, there were some elements that I thought were pretty cool in terms of how Parks writes stage directions and gives her actors a lot of freedom to make different choices. With all that being said, I think I'm gonna go ahead and put this in indifferent, but in a good way. We started with Confessions by Augustine. Just like Virgil, this was a book that drove me crazy, not just because of its sheer length, but also because of how boring it was. If you're gonna make a book that long, at least make it interesting. It was Augustine basically ranting about everything he'd ever done in his life and why he was a bad person because of it. There are about 50 pages dedicated to this man talking about this one time he stole a freaking pear. Now, sure, I'm oversimplifying the book and really stripping it down of what Augustine is trying to do. But on the surface, this book is terrible to read. I also just generally had nothing to say about this text in class because it was so boring. I think we all know where Confessions is going. It's going in the pits of Dante's hell. After Confessions, we moved on to the Lais of Marie de France. The Lais are basically fairy tales. I guess they reminded me of parables also in terms of how people should act in relationships and what the consequences are of doing bad things in a relationship, particularly cheating on your spouse or trying to murder them. There were some really beautiful lays, and I love the way the relationship was described between the two people and also just the general aesthetic of the lays. I do like reading fairy tales, so reading this was something that was pretty interesting for me. I thought that this was a pretty good mix of different stories and characters. Overall, this was a pretty good read. Marie de France is gonna end up going in indifferent, but in a good way. The next text we read was The Translator of Desires by Ibn Arabi. The Translator of Desires is a collection of Arabic love poetry. I was really looking forward to this text. I'd heard a lot of great things about it. For me, I also thought that a lot of the poetry was really beautiful. The version of the text we had showed the original Arabic text and then the translation next to it, and I thought that was a really great way of being able to read the poetry and to compare the two. With 61 poems, I definitely had things that I liked more than others, and we couldn't talk about every single poem. Overall, I did really enjoy this text, so I think I'm gonna put it in holding a symposium for. The next text we read is Inferno by Dante. Obviously, like everyone else, I'd heard so much about this text. I thought it was pretty cool that the author was inserting himself into the work so you could see his own journey, and I think that added something to the narrative perspective. Just seeing the progression of Dante deeper and deeper into the levels and getting a vast amount of detail as to what things looked like, who inhabited each level, and even seeing Dante interact with different characters and get to know their stories. There were a couple things though that I wasn't a big fan of. For example, the different levels of hell. Some of them didn't really make sense to me or how the ordering was created. But once again, this is just his own opinion about what hell looks like, and I can't really dock the book too much for it not being the same as to what I thought it might look like. So there was definitely a balance of good and bad things in this book. I liked reading it. I don't think I'll ever reread it again, but there were certainly some things that I wasn't expecting to have to encounter that just kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. I think for all of these reasons, I'm gonna have to leave Inferno in indifferent, but in a good way. The next text we read was a series of essays by Montaigne. I absolutely hated this book. I thought, once again, that this was so terribly boring. The only reason that we had to read it and it had so much notoriety is the fact that this man was a rich white man back in the day and age, and he had nothing better to do other than to write every single opinion that ever passed through his head down and force people like me to read it. I honestly don't really understand how this text got so much notoriety or popularity in the canon of literature, because there's not a lot to it other than this guy talking about his opinions on everything. And when I say everything, I really do mean everything. In one of his essays, this man even gives his opinion on wearing pants. I just thought this book was ridiculous. If I wrote out a book of 107 different opinions of mine and each one was 20 pages in length, I would not make anyone read that. I would call that a diary and then go talk to a therapist. I would not publish those thoughts publicly. And I just really didn't understand why we were reading this text. Also, the thing that irritated me the most about this text was more related to the class itself. In class, we were asked to analyze this man's thoughts and why he had said something the way he said it. This is a book about opinions. The man said something because he thought it. There was nothing deeper than that. It was never really that serious in the first place to begin with. And I don't know why we were being asked to read this with such intense seriousness and academicness. I did not understand why this was in academia, why we were being asked to analyze this man's own thoughts. Like, we were not reading a literary text where there were characters and there was plot and there was setting and there were things happening. This guy was just giving his opinion about the meals he likes eating and how much he likes eating per day and why he doesn't like going to the doctor. I was thinking about being gracious and putting it in why did I pay tuition for this, but even the golden ass does not deserve that. So you know where it's going. I'm throwing it into the pits of Dante's hell. I've talked quite a bit of shit about some of these texts, but now we're moving on to some of the texts that I enjoyed more. And speaking of more, which is a horrible pun that I didn't even mean to make, the next text that we read was Othello by Shakespeare. Is it really a literature course if you're not being made to read at least one text by Shakespeare? I don't know. English teachers, you tell me. I was pretty excited to read Othello, and I was glad we weren't doing something like Romeo and Juliet or Hamlet or Macbeth. You know what I was not excited for though? Is all the internal racism that's happening in this book. I know this was written by Shakespeare, who is like super problematic and he has a lot of issues, but I was pretty uncomfortable with a lot of the stuff that was happening in Othello. Also, you know what's not fun is doing research about a book and then seeing Anthony Hopkins in blackface playing this character. So that was weird. The recent version that was performed by the National Theatre is a really great version of Othello, and I watched that whole thing in its entirety. No, I was not required to do it. I did it for fun. So that version was really great. The book itself is honestly probably one of my favorite Shakespeare texts I've ever read. I know I'm like an English major and stuff, but personally, I'm not a huge fan of Shakespeare. I just feel like Shakespeare is meant to be watched, not necessarily read. So in the past, when I've had to read Shakespeare, it hasn't been super enjoyable to me. So I always go into reading these texts with some hesitancy because I don't know how the reading process is going to be for me. But this was actually a text that I really enjoyed reading it because this text has some of the most beautiful Shakespearean writing I've ever read. I also love the tragedy and the heaviness of this text. I think that's like, there's something wrong with me. I think it's got to go up here in Currently Kissing the Earth. The next text we have is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. High school me was obsessed with this book. The first time I read it was in my junior year for my AP literature class, and I loved this book so much. I don't know what happened, but it had a real hold on me. My professor at the time also had a really large background in women's and gender studies, so I think I found it really inspiring to see her take on this book, which I think is more of a non-traditional take. I just don't think I really vibed with the class that I was in because my professor had different ideas about what we were going to talk about and what we were going to do with the text, and so honestly that made reading it not a super fun experience for me. So with the class itself, it definitely, I think, impacted the experience I had rereading the text, but I have a lot of really good memories with Frankenstein. I just had one strong conception of what I thought the text was about and what I thought Shelley was trying to do, and my professor was not interested in talking about that and wanted to do some other stuff. But despite all of my issues with how we discussed it in class, I'm still gonna go ahead and put it in holding a symposium for. As I've been editing, I had the realization that I forgot to include one of the books. This book is The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Like Frankenstein, this is a book I've read before in high school, and so I got to read it again in this class. This is not my favorite book ever. I have read lots of Kafka before, and it's probably not my favorite writing by Kafka either, but I do like the general plot of the book. I think it's a really interesting book, and there's a lot to dissect there, so this was definitely a book that was fun to cover in class because there are a lot of layers to what Kafka is talking about. The book is also very short, which I think is another added bonus to reading it. I also think Kafka does a really cool job of utilizing setting or emphasizing the lack of space that the characters inhabit. There's something very claustrophobic about the book, and this feeling sort of drags on as time passes. And I think it makes you understand the characters and what's happening even more. Considering that this was a book I forgot to put on this list despite having read it multiple times for school, I think I'm gonna go ahead and put it on indifferent but in a good way. After Frankenstein, we read the posthumous Memoirs of Cubas, which is by Brazilian author Machado de Assis. It's focused on the main character, Cubas, who has already died by the time the book is started. He is writing his memoirs or his autobiography from the grave. I thought this was really clever to see how he was writing it, and also the perspective it gives you about what we might be okay with sharing or writing about if we're already dead. I think the other really humorous thing about this book is that Cubas is not a super likable character. He is more of an anti-hero really, but I feel like there's a sense of awareness that we see. And there's also a really interesting fourth wall thing that is happening where the editing process is being conducted by the character himself since he's the one writing the book. The book structure is also really interesting. I think there are about 160 chapters and they're all pretty episodic. So some of them vary in length, but most of the time the chapters are fairly short, which was also just nice as a college student taking other classes. And in general, Assis plays around with a lot of different writing methods and tools to create humor in the book, and it works in a very weird way for a modern audience, I think. My classmates and I thought this book was pretty funny, but as my professor pointed out to us, it wasn't found exactly humorous at the time when the book was originally published. So I definitely do think the book has aged well in terms of how it's received now. In general, I thought this book was pretty good and I enjoyed reading it. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and put it in holding a symposium for. After this, we read Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This was hands down my favorite book of the entire year. I absolutely adore this book and I have it right here. I had a hard time getting through the first few chapters, but after that, it took off from there. I was so obsessed with this book that this was actually the first book I went to since I think Sappho, and I annotated it. So you can see I highlighted my favorite sections in pink. And this is a book that I had promised myself I would eventually go back and read and annotate the whole thing, because I didn't start annotating it until I got towards, I think, one of the later parts, maybe around part 4. This was just such an amazing book. I loved the writing style. I loved the way the characters were created. I think there's definitely a difference between reading books for enjoyment and then reading them for school. But this was definitely a book that bordered between the two, and it made me feel like I wasn't necessarily reading it for class. So I would 100% recommend to read this. Obviously, this book has to go in Currently Kissing the Earth. After we read my favorite text ever, we moved on to the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. I'm gonna put a disclaimer here because I have some internal bias. I am not a fan of Woolf. I have read one of her other books before, Mrs. Dalloway, and I just did not get it. I do feel like she's an author that's really hyped up and doesn't live up to the expectation, at least for me personally. Her writing style is postmodern, and that is just a writing style that I have difficult time with understanding because it's hard to see the passage of time in these books, and there's a lot of stream of consciousness writing. I feel like I need a little bit more structure when I'm reading a text. I just have personal issues with Virginia Woolf as a person in general, and it's definitely something that I think shows in this particular text. For example, the main character, Lily Briscoe, is described numerous times throughout this entire novel as the girl with little Chinese eyes, and I don't know, I had a lot of weird feelings about that being the description, and I think I ended up going back and counting every single time Woolf said that, and the number was definitely up there. So that wasn't super pleasant for me to read. It kind of made me angry while reading it, and like other Woolf books, the ending was sort of vague. I didn't really understand what was going on, what had happened, what we had accomplished from reading this. I think I'm gonna have to maybe not rank this as highly. I will say for my final exam, I did write an essay about this novel, so I guess it couldn't have been all that bad since I did have a lot to get out of it, academically speaking. And that was something I did like about the book, is that there was a lot to discuss in terms of choices Woolf was making. So I'm sort of torn about where I'm gonna place this book. I think I'm gonna have to put this in, why did I pay tuition for this? I don't know why I was in a class where I had to hear the phrase girl with little Chinese eyes so many times. Moving on before anyone can get too upset with me about this, we're gonna talk about Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. I was so excited to read this text for numerous reasons. First, it showcased the transition into what we were reading, because now we were reading more of a contemporary author. And I've just also always wanted to read stuff by Toni Morrison, and for some reason just never got around to doing it. I thought Song of Solomon was a pretty cool book. I really enjoyed Morrison's writing style and the way that she creates the characters. So this book is focused on a male character named Milkman, and basically the relationships he has with all of the women around him in his family. However, Milkman is more focused on digging into his family history, but specifically looking at the history of the men in his family. So there are a lot of interesting things happening between Milkman and the other characters in this novel, and I thought it was really clever the way Morrison was able to portray this protagonist. Definitely a good experience reading Morrison. I just thought this book was so clever in terms of all of the connections between the main character and the people around him, specifically how we are supposed to be viewing the women in the novel, because they're shown to have more of a supporting or minor role, but Morrison has a sneaky way of showing us that there's actually a different side we're supposed to be looking at. I might put this book in holding a symposium for, because it's definitely something I like talking about and really makes me want to read more Morrison. We are on to the final book of the year. Citizen: An American Lyric is a 2014 book published by an American poet, Claudia Rankine. It includes a lot of poetry and series of lyric essays, and it's all related to racial tensions and relations within the United States. I actually had a teacher from last semester that I admired a lot and had talked to her about some experiences I had at school, and she had recommended for me to read this book and given me her own copy of it. And then I realized we were going to read it for the literature humanities class. I think it was definitely worth reading. Once again, there's a really cool writing style that Rankine has, a lot of second person point of view that we see. And I like the way that Rankine is able to discuss her own experiences, really gives you this doorway into her own life. There were a lot of parts of this book that were really moving and very difficult to read. I did not like the way that Columbia structured these texts though, and this is something our professor talked to us about, because I'm not sure if you can tell, but the very last two texts we read of the year are Song of Solomon and Citizen, and they're both by Black authors. That felt very performative in terms of how we were reading the text and how were they structured for us to read. Rankine actually came to Columbia a few years ago, and she herself highlighted that she could tell that Columbia was doing something a bit performative by placing her book within this class. I honestly think that because of the way it was structured in our class, it does make me a bit indifferent to how we're supposed to perceive it. It was designed in a way that we didn't really have a lot of time to really spend on each of these works and discuss them individually. So I do think that impacted how I approached the text and the amount that I was able to get out of it. So I do think that I'm gonna put it in indifferent, but in a good way. I liked the book, I just don't like the context in which we had to read it. And I don't think I got a lot out of the discussions we had in class about it. I think it was more of a disservice to the book actually, and I think I would have had a better experience just reading it outside of an academic setting. Okay, so that is the final tier ranking list of all the books Columbia made me read last year. I think I'm actually gonna move the Odyssey down to indifferent, but in a good way, because I think I did end up enjoying the Iliad more than the Odyssey. Yeah, I think looking at everything, I'm pretty happy with how this looks. Let me know what you think about this tier ranking if you've read any of these books. Thanks for watching. Bye!